His dog stopped at the fog line and wouldn't obey. An abandoned aircraft carrier slept on Lake Superior, erased from maps and memory. A veteran Navy SEAL followed the leash and stepped into someone else's crime. A missing journalist.
Salvage workers.
A salvage
They're unloading
crew.
the crates right now.
Evidence they planned to burn. The water was rising, the night was closing, and loyalty started bleeding. Sometimes God doesn't warn with thunder. He sends a dog who remembers. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. The north end of Minnesota wore summer like a blessing that had learned restraint. Pine trees stood in ranks along the shoreline of Lake Superior, their needles combing the wind into a low, steady hymn. The water was so clear in the morning that it looked less like a lake and more like the sky deciding to live on the ground for a while. Sunlight lingered here, long, patient, almost theatrical, stretching the day as if it were trying to persuade everyone to stay. Caleb Ashford did not feel persuaded. He was 43, 6'1", broad-shouldered, built like a man who had spent most of his life being useful in places where usefulness was measured in breath and heartbeat. His face was angular, the jawline hard enough to look carved, softened only by the rough, honest shadow of a short beard that refused to grow evenly. A faint sunburn browned his skin, the kind that came from living outside without realizing it was a choice. His eyes, blue-gray, deep-set, looked like weather, calm until it wasn't. His hair was cut short in a practical military style, dark brown with early silver at the temples, as if time had tested him and left its fingerprints where everyone could see. He wore the same outfit almost every day, an olive field jacket that had seen rain and regret, dark blue cargo pants, a red and deep green flannel shirt underneath, worn brown leather boots, and an old military watch with a scratched face that still kept perfect time. A folding pocket knife rode in his pocket like an old habit. An Eberle stock half-track backpack sat by the cabin door like a loyal shadow. Caleb lived alone in a small cabin tucked behind a wall of pines. That was the point. His nearest neighbor was the wind, and even the wind did not ask questions. But the quiet wasn't free. On the small kitchen table, among a tin coffee can and a stack of repair receipts, lay an envelope from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Caleb didn't open it right away. He stared at it the way a man stares at a storm cloud that hasn't decided whether it's coming for him. Because the VA wasn't just paperwork, it was judgment. It was a system that could look at a single bad decision and decide he was still a battlefield in human form. And if they decided that, if they wrote the wrong sentence in the wrong file, Ranger could be taken. That was the part that made Caleb's chest tighten. Ranger was a German Shepherd K9 with a compact athletic build, muscle clean and functional, not bulky. The body of a dog made for sprinting and stopping on a dime. His coat was short and thick, black across the back and muzzle with warm tan along his legs and chest, a pattern that made him look like he'd been painted by firelight. His ears stood tall and alert, and his eyes were dark, intelligent, always scanning, like he believed the world was full of invisible doors, and it was his job to watch them. Ranger was disciplined in the way only a working dog could be. He did not waste motion. He did not bark at nothing. But he noticed everything. Shifts in wind, changes in Caleb's breathing, the faintest oddity in a familiar sound, when danger felt known, when it carried the scent of something that had once hurt them. Ranger would stop even without a command, a silent warning planted into the ground. His gear was simple, a black tactical collar with a metal ID tag stamped Ranger, K9, and a Ranger green harness with a sturdy handle on top. No flashy patches, no loud branding. Ranger didn't need decoration to look serious. He was serious. This morning, Caleb tried to pretend it was an ordinary day. He brewed coffee, black, bitter, honest. He sat on the cabin steps, watching the lake in the distance through the trees. Ranger lay beside him, head on his paws, but not asleep. Ranger never truly slept when Caleb was awake. It was as if the dog had appointed himself guardian of Caleb's mind. Caleb took a sip and exhaled. Somewhere inside him, an old part of his brain still listened for rotor blades. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. Silence had become his language, and Ranger spoke it fluently. The phone buzzed. Caleb stared at it for 3 breaths before picking up. "Ashford," he said. A voice on the line, measured, professional, not unkind. "Caleb, it's Dr. Marcus Vale." Dr. Marcus Vale was the kind of man who spoke like he was carrying something fragile through a crowded room. In his mid-50s, he'd once been athletic, but years of late nights and long conversations had softened him into a shape that suggested patience rather than power. He had a calm baritone, the sort of voice that could lower a person's blood pressure without trying. Caleb had met him at the VA clinic in Duluth, where the chairs were stiff and the coffee was terrible and the walls were too clean to feel real. "How you holding up?" Vale asked. Caleb glanced at Ranger, as if checking whether he was allowed to be honest. "I'm fine." That's not an answer. Caleb's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a surrender. "I'm functioning." That's closer. Vale paused. "Your review is coming up. I need you to stay steady, Caleb. No incidents, no impulsive choices." Caleb felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten, like someone had tightened straps around him. "I know." And Vale hesitated, choosing his words with surgeon precision. "Ranger's status is tied to your stability assessment. You understand that?" Caleb's eyes drifted to the dog. Ranger's ears had lifted at the sound of Vale's voice, though the words meant nothing to him. Or perhaps they meant everything, in some language older than human. "I understand," Caleb said quietly. "Good." Vale softened his tone. "Go for your runs. Keep your routines. Call me if the nights get worse." Caleb looked out toward the lake again. "Yeah," he said, and ended the call. For a moment, the sunlight felt less like warmth and more like a spotlight. Ranger rose, stretched, and nudged Caleb's knee with his nose. Gentle, but insistent, like a soldier reminding another soldier to drink water. Caleb snorted once, the closest he came to laughter most days. "Yeah," he murmured to the dog. "I heard him." Ranger's tail gave a single, controlled thump. Then he froze. It happened so abruptly that Caleb's humor evaporated. Ranger's body went rigid. His ears locked forward. His gaze snapped toward the eastern tree line, toward a part of the shoreline where the land curved into a narrow, fog-prone inlet. Caleb followed the dog's stare. From here, he couldn't see the inlet itself, but he could see the faint smear of mist above it, even on a bright morning, a patch of lingering gray, like a bruise the day refused to heal. "That place," Caleb muttered. Locals called it Dead Man's Reach, not because bodies floated there. Lake Superior kept its secrets too well for that, but because people who went too close tended to lose something. A boat motor, a fishing net, a sense of direction, a chunk of courage. It was a place with a reputation and a long memory. Caleb didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in patterns. Ranger moved down the dock, slow and deliberate, as if his paws had suddenly become instruments of measurement. He stopped at the edge, nose lifted, breathing in. And then, something Caleb hadn't seen in a long time. Ranger whined. Not a complaint, not a fear, a sound, like longing. Caleb's throat tightened. "All right," he said, as if conceding to fate. "All right, buddy. We'll look." He grabbed the kayak, checked the strap on Ranger's harness, and pushed off. The lake greeted them with calm brilliance, the water bright enough to sting the eyes. Kayaking out felt like sliding across glass. The air smelled of pine sap and cold stone, and something metallic that Caleb couldn't name. As they neared the inlet, the temperature dropped slightly. The sunlight thinned. The mist grew thicker, curling around the kayak like curious fingers. Ranger stood with his front paws braced, scanning. Caleb's heartbeat slowed, not from peace but from training. This wasn't combat, but it felt like an approach. The shoreline narrowed, forming a throat of rock and trees. The fog was heavier here, an old curtain that didn't want to be drawn aside. Then Caleb saw something at the waterline. A small object tangled in weeds, half submerged, flashing dull silver. He paddled closer and reached down. It was a dog tag, old, scratched, the chain partly rusted, as if it had been gnawed by time. Caleb turned it over. The name was worn, but still legible enough to stab him with recognition. Cole. Ethan. Caleb's mouth went dry. Ranger made a sound, low, almost like a broken sigh, and stared at the tag as if it had spoken. Caleb's hand trembled. "No," he whispered. "Ethan Cole. The first handler Ranger ever had, officially dead." A file closed. A story finished. And yet here was the tag, floating near a fog-covered inlet like a breadcrumb thrown by the past. A shiver ran up Caleb's spine. This was the moment the chapter's rhythm changed, the re-hook that tightened the invisible net around the viewer's attention. Because now it wasn't just a strange place. It was personal. It was impossible. Caleb tucked the dog tag into his pocket with care that looked almost reverent. He paddled onward. The fog thickened, and for a second the world vanished. No shoreline, no horizon, only gray and the soft slap of water against the kayak. Then something dark emerged ahead, massive and still. At first, Caleb thought it was a cliff. But cliffs didn't have straight lines. Cliffs didn't have rust. As they pushed closer, the shape clarified. A hulking steel vessel, half hidden in mist, grounded against jagged rocks as if the lake itself had chosen to hold it captive. It wasn't an aircraft carrier, too small for that, wrong for an inland lake. But it was large enough to make Caleb's breath catch. A former naval research ship, he realized. An old Cold War test vessel, retrofitted with a flat deck and equipment mounts. The hull was the color of dried blood, streaked with corrosion. A broken radar mast leaned like a snapped spear. The sides bore the scars of scraping rock. And where a name should have been, there was only bare metal. Someone had erased it. Ranger leapt onto the deck with the smooth confidence of a dog who had done harder things in worse places. His paws clicked softly on steel. He moved with disciplined caution, sniffing the seams, tracking invisible history. Caleb climbed up after him, boots scraping. The deck smelled like rust, algae, and old oil, like a machine that had been left to dream too long. Then Caleb saw it. A footprint in dust near the center of the deck. Modern, fresh, the tread pattern sharp. Someone had been here recently. Caleb's fingers tightened around the edge of his jacket. "This isn't a museum," he murmured. Ranger didn't look back. He walked to a stairwell leading down, then stopped at a heavy steel door below deck. The door was chained. Ranger sat in front of it, perfectly still, ears forward, eyes fixed as if he could see through metal. Caleb stepped closer. "Ranger," he said softly. The dog didn't move. Caleb crouched, listening. The lake was quiet outside, but inside the ship, the silence felt different. Dense, intentional, like a held breath. Ranger lowered his head, pressed his nose to the seam of the door, inhaled. And then he made that sound again. A whimper. Thin, aching, not fear, but memory. Caleb's eyes burned. He looked out through the broken railings at the bright world beyond the fog, the sunlit pines, the innocent blue water, and felt the old truth settle into his bones. Sometimes, the past doesn't return with explosions. Sometimes it returns on a bright summer morning, carried by a dog's nose and a name that shouldn't exist. And Caleb, who had come to the north to escape history, realized history had been waiting for him in the mist. The fog did not lift when Caleb expected it to. It thinned, yes, but only enough to suggest shapes rather than surrender them. The vessel loomed in fragments, a rusted railing here, a broken antenna mast there, patches of peeled paint like old scars across a steel hide. Caleb stood on the deck beside Ranger and let his breathing settle. Up close, the ship felt less like an object and more like a body. Steel plates were riveted in long seams along the hull. Corrosion ran in streaks like dried tears. On the port side, just beneath the ghost outline of where a name should have been, someone had deliberately ground away the letters. The metal there was raw, lighter, newer than the rest of the hull, as if memory had been surgically removed. Ranger paced slowly, nose working. Caleb crouched, running a hand along the deck surface. The texture was uneven, layered with dust and flakes of rust. But beneath that, boot prints. At least 2 different tread patterns, one deep, one shallow, both recent. He straightened and scanned the shoreline through the broken rails. Dead Man's Reach was quiet, but not innocent. The inlet curved inward like a hooked finger, rocky walls rising on both sides. Pine trees clung stubbornly to stone ledges. Even in summer, the water here looked darker, colder, less forgiving. There were stories about this place, not ghost stories, practical ones. Boats stalled here more often than anywhere else. Compasses wavered. Fishermen lost nets to sudden undertows near the rocks. Some blamed the old military experiments. Some blamed the geology. Most simply avoided it. Caleb had never cared much for rumors, but he cared about patterns. And the pattern was this. Someone had erased the ship's name, and someone had been here recently. Ranger moved toward the stairwell leading below deck. He did not hesitate this time. Caleb followed. The stairwell groaned under their weight. Metal grated against metal with a hollow complaint. The air below was cooler, thick with the smell of oil, algae, and something else. Chemical, faint but present, like a machine that had once worked too hard and never been properly cleaned. The lower corridor was narrow. Cables hung loose from overhead conduits. A cracked control panel leaned against a bulkhead, wires spilling from its belly like exposed veins. The layout made sense to Caleb. He had seen ships before, though not like this. This vessel had once been modified. Extra mounts welded onto structural beams, reinforced brackets near what must have been equipment bays. A research platform. Sonar, maybe. Cold War era. He moved carefully, boots landing where Ranger had already stepped. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy steel door, thick, industrial, chained. Ranger sat before it, not whining now, not pacing, just watching. Caleb examined the chain. The lock wasn't ancient. The metal was newer than the door itself. That detail bothered him more than anything else. This wasn't simply abandonment. Someone had secured this door long after the ship had been left to rust. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the cool edge of the dog tag he'd found earlier. He didn't take it out. Instead, he pulled his folding knife and knelt beside the lock. He paused. "Easy," he murmured. Not to himself, but to Ranger. The dog's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to the door. Caleb worked the knife carefully, testing the tension. The mechanism resisted, but not with the stubbornness of something untouched for decades. After a few minutes, the chain loosened enough to slip. The door creaked open. Inside was a storage compartment, small, cramped, but not empty. A backpack, modern, dark gray, not military issue. Caleb froze. Ranger stepped inside first, sniffing the air. His tail lifted slightly, not aggressive, not alarmed, but alert in a different way. There was food packaging on the floor, water bottles, a flashlight, and a camera. Someone had been living here, or hiding. Caleb picked up the camera. It was a mid-range DSLR, used but cared for. He scrolled through the images. Photographs of the deck, of the shoreline, of metal equipment stacked near the stern, of men in reflective vests. One image zoomed in on a crane mounted to a barge anchored near the rocks. Another captured a close-up of a steel crate being lowered from the deck into a waiting boat. This wasn't teenagers exploring a legend. This was organized. Ranger's ears shifted. Footsteps, light, above them. Caleb's muscles tightened automatically, every nerve awake. The footsteps paused. Then a voice, young, female, steady but carrying strain. "You're not supposed to be here." Caleb turned slowly. At the doorway stood a girl, 13, maybe 14. Thin but not frail. Sunlight filtered down the stairwell behind her, outlining her shape in pale gold. Her hair was blonde, pulled into a messy ponytail, strands falling loose around her face. Freckles dusted. Her cheeks. Her eyes were blue, sharp, evaluating, older than her age. She wore jeans too long for her legs and hiking boots that had seen mud and determination. A windbreaker hung loosely over her shoulders. She was holding a small pocket knife. Not well, but bravely. Caleb raised both hands slightly, palms open. "That depends," he said evenly. "Who says I'm not?" She studied him. Her gaze flicked to Ranger. Ranger did not move. The girl swallowed. "My name is Eliza Monroe," she said, "and that's my stuff." Her voice didn't tremble, but it carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Caleb lowered his hands. "I'm Caleb Ashford," he replied. "This is Ranger." At the sound of his name, Ranger glanced at him briefly, then returned his focus to Eliza. Not as a threat, but as a variable. Eliza stepped inside the compartment cautiously. "You're not with them," she said. Caleb's brow furrowed. "With who?" "The salvage crew." The word hung in the air like a dropped nail. Eliza moved past him, checking the camera. "They come at night," she continued. "They think no one watches this place." She spoke like someone repeating facts she'd already memorized. Caleb studied her more closely. There was dirt on her sleeves, a bruise near her wrist, not fresh, but recent. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said quietly. Eliza's jaw tightened. "My dad was here," she said, "before he disappeared." The word disappeared did not sound dramatic when she said it. It sounded clinical. Caleb felt a slow, heavy shift in his chest. "What does your dad do?" he asked. "Did," she corrected. "He's a journalist." "Of course." Eliza crouched beside her bag, pulling out a folded notebook. Pages filled with handwriting. Dates, times, boat descriptions, license plate numbers scribbled in the margins. "He was investigating the ship," she said. "It's not just scrap metal. It was a Navy research vessel. Sonar testing, 1968. Caleb nodded slightly. "That tracks." "They said it was abandoned after an accident," Eliza went on. "But there were legal disputes. Something about equipment that wasn't decommissioned properly." Her voice lowered. "Some of it's still valuable." Ranger moved closer to her. Eliza stiffened at first. But when Ranger sat calmly beside her, She blinked in surprise. He leaned forward, sniffed her jacket sleeve. Then he pressed his nose gently against her hand. Caleb watched carefully. Ranger did not offer trust lightly. Eliza exhaled slowly, tension draining from her shoulders. "He likes you," Caleb said. She gave a small, humorless smile. "Most dogs don't." There was something in that admission, loneliness wrapped in defiance. Ranger's posture changed suddenly. He lifted his head sharply, not toward the door, toward the wall, a section of metal paneling near the far corner. He stepped forward and placed one paw against it, then another. He did not bark. He stared. Eliza frowned. "What is it?" Caleb moved closer. The panel looked ordinary, rusted like the rest. But Ranger's breathing had shifted, slow, intense, focused. He scraped lightly at the metal. Caleb leaned in. Behind the panel, faint but distinct, came a sound. A vibration, not wind, not water. An engine, low, distant, but real. Eliza's face went pale. "They're early," she whispered. Caleb's pulse steadied rather than raced. Training did that. He looked at Ranger, the dog's eyes met his. No panic, just readiness. Caleb stood. "How many?" he asked. Eliza swallowed. 3, sometimes 4. Outside, beyond the hull, the faint hum of a motorboat drifted closer through the fog. The sunlight above deck flickered as something passed between ship and shore. Caleb glanced at the chained door, at the corridor, at the narrow stairwell that now felt smaller. He had come here out of curiosity. Now he was in someone else's operation. And Dr. Vale's warning echoed in his mind. No incidents. No impulsive choices. Caleb looked at Eliza. "You have somewhere safe to go?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Caleb turned to Ranger. "Quiet," he said softly. Ranger lowered himself into a crouch instantly. The engine noise grew louder, closer, and in the dim, rusted belly of a ship that had lost its name. 3 lives waited, silent and still, while something else approached through the fog. The ship held its breath. Below deck, the air felt older than the daylight outside. Cooler, heavier, threaded with rust and faint chemical ghosts. Caleb Ashford moved through the narrow corridor with the careful economy of a man who had learned that noise could be a beacon. His olive field jacket brushed the bulkheads as he passed, and the worn leather of his boots made soft, measured scuffs on metal that no longer remembered footsteps. Ranger stayed close, harness handle within reach, black and tan coat barely visible in the dim. The German shepherd's posture was work pure, spine steady, ears forward, muzzle low, as if the floor itself carried messages. His eyes dark, intelligent, tracked angles and shadows like a living radar. Eliza Monroe walked a step behind them, trying hard not to look like she was trying hard. 13 years old and stubborn as a winter sunrise, she carried herself with a brittle bravery that didn't quite fit her narrow shoulders. Her blonde ponytail had loosened. Strands fell around her freckled cheeks. Dirt lived under her nails. There was a bruise on her wrist that she pretended didn't exist. When she spoke, her voice stayed level, but her breathing always betrayed the truth, fast and shallow, like she was running even when standing still. Caleb kept his voice low. "Show me what you've seen," he said. Eliza pointed down the corridor. "Equipment bay," she whispered. "That's where they go." They moved past a collapsed cable tray and a broken panel of dials whose needles were frozen mid-sentence. In places, the ship's interior looked like a hollowed-out animal, structural ribs exposed, wiring dangling like tendons. But someone had been here recently. Dust was disturbed. Rust flakes had been brushed aside in a few spots, as if hands had searched for something with purpose. Ranger stopped at a junction where the corridor split. He sniffed the air once, long and slow. then chose the left path without hesitation. Caleb felt a familiar tightening behind his ribs. Not fear, recognition. Ranger wasn't guessing. He was following a trail. They reached a reinforced hatch with faded warning paint around the edges. The metal beside the latch bore scratches that didn't match the ship's slow decay. These were newer, the impatient marks of tools. Caleb tested the latch. It gave. Inside was a compact technical compartment. Racks bolted to the walls, most empty, some half removed. The smell changed immediately. Less algae, more machine oil and old electronics. It was the scent of a place that once hummed with purpose. Eliza swallowed. "This is where my dad was," she said. "I found his footprint here. He wore those hiking boots with the red laces." Caleb didn't ask how she knew what her father's footprints looked like. A child searching for a missing parent learns strange skills. The world forces it. Ranger moved deeper into the compartment, nose close to the floor, then up along a cable. Run. His tail lifted slightly, an indicator of focus, not excitement. He stopped at a section of wall where a steel panel sat flush. He stared. Caleb stepped closer and ran his fingers along the seam. The panel didn't match the others. The screws were newer, the edges cleaner. Someone had replaced it, or accessed it recently. He pulled his pocket knife and worked it into the seam. The panel popped free with a reluctant sigh. Behind it sat a hard case the size of a small toolbox, dark, reinforced, with a faded government-style label half scraped off. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't theatrical. It was simply consequential. Caleb lifted it carefully and set it on the deck. His old military watch ticked, steady and indifferent. Eliza's eyes widened. That's what they were taking," she said. "I saw them move a case like that." Caleb flipped the latches. Inside was a data unit, an old sonar recording module, metal-cased, with ports and serial plates. Not pretty, not dramatic, but valuable in the way evidence is valuable, because it refuses to be argued with. Tucked beneath it was a small cassette tape in a plastic sleeve. Caleb's throat tightened. A tape meant a voice. A voice meant a human choice frozen in time. Eliza leaned in, hope and fear braided together on her face. "Is that—" she started. Caleb held up a hand. "Careful," he said softly. "We don't know what's on it yet." He looked around for a player, found none. The ship had been stripped too clean. Ranger, however, turned away from the case as if the metal no longer mattered. His attention had locked onto something else in the compartment. A cloth. A simple strip of fabric caught on a protruding bolt. Darkened by age, but not fully eaten by rot. It looked like it had once been part of a uniform sleeve or a training rag. Nothing special to an untrained eye. To Ranger, it was thunder. The dog stepped forward so slowly it felt ceremonial. He lowered his muzzle, inhaled once, and froze as if the breath had struck him. Then Ranger made a sound Caleb had never heard from him in a place this quiet. Not a bark, not a growl. A low, broken whine, soft, aching, intimate. Eliza's face changed. In an instant, her bravado cracked, and a child looked out from behind it. Caleb crouched beside Ranger. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey, buddy." Ranger didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the cloth like it was a doorway. Caleb reached out, took the fabric carefully, and brought it close enough to smell. Old sweat, old soap, and beneath it, an unmistakable trace of something familiar. Gun oil, leather, and a faint antiseptic tang that belonged to med kits and training fields. Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't say the name out loud. He didn't have to. Ranger's body was saying it for him. Eliza swallowed again. "That's not my dad's," she said. "No," Caleb murmured. "It isn't." He folded the cloth and slipped it into his jacket pocket with the kind of reverence usually reserved for flags. The compartment felt suddenly smaller, as if the ship had leaned in to listen. Caleb forced himself back to the practical. "We need to hear the tape," he said. Eliza nodded quickly. "I have a small recorder at my hiding spot," she whispered. "It plays cassettes." Caleb studied her. "You came prepared." Eliza's mouth tightened. "When you're waiting for someone to come home," she said, "you don't get to be unprepared." Ranger turned sharply toward the doorway, ears pricked. Footsteps? No. Not footsteps. A vibration, faint, irregular, traveling through the metal floor like distant thunder. Caleb held still, listening. The vibration faded. Ranger remained tense for 3 more seconds, then eased. Whatever it was, it hadn't committed to coming closer. Caleb exhaled through his nose. He hated how quickly his mind mapped threats in a place that wasn't supposed to require it. He hated that a part of him missed being useful. They moved out of the compartment and into a slightly wider corridor lined with old lockers. Most were open, emptied, their doors hanging like tongues. One locker, however, was closed. Ranger went straight to it. Caleb frowned. What now? Ranger pressed his nose to the seam, then sat, perfectly, obediently, like a soldier waiting for permission. Caleb opened the locker. Inside was a battered field notebook sealed in a plastic bag, edges warped. A pencil, a small keyring with 2 keys, and a folded sheet of paper with a corner torn off. Eliza stepped closer, eyes wide. "That wasn't here before," she whispered. Caleb's pulse quickened. On the first page of the notebook, in blocky handwriting that looked practiced and restrained, was a name, or what remained of one. The ink had bled, but the letters were still readable. E. Cole. Caleb felt the ship tilt, though it didn't move at all. He flipped through the pages carefully. Many were water damaged, but some lines survived. Coordinates, dates, shorthand notes about signal anomalies, equipment removal, chain of custody. Not a diary, a log. The kind someone keeps when they don't trust the official story to remember correctly. Eliza's hand covered her mouth. Caleb's voice came out rougher than he intended. "How did this get here?" he asked. Eliza shook her head, almost frightened by the answer she didn't have. "I've never seen it," she whispered. "I swear." Ranger stared at the notebook with a solemn intensity. As if the dog understood that paper could be bones, Caleb tucked the notebook into his backpack, then took the cassette tape and the keys. He glanced at the torn sheet of paper. Only a few words remained, but one stood out, written heavier, pressed harder into the page. Hale. A surname, a weight. Eliza looked up at Caleb, eyes shining with fear and a sudden, fierce hope. "My dad," he said. "Something about a salvage boss," she whispered. "Victor Hale." Caleb's jaw tightened, the hard angles of his face sharpening as if the past had called his name. Victor Hale. Not here in person, but his presence crept into the corridor like cold. Caleb imagined him, a man in his 50s, thick-necked and sun-weathered, wearing confidence like armor, someone who smiled in daylight and stole in darkness. The kind of man who could point at a ship and call it scrap, while knowing exactly what it was worth. Caleb looked down at Ranger. Ranger's gaze held his, steady and unblinking. There was no pleading in it, only certainty. Caleb felt the old moral knot tighten inside him. The one that war had tied and peace had never fully untied. If he walked away, he kept his quiet. He kept his VA review clean. He kept Ranger safe. on paper. But if he walked away, Eliza stayed alone with a mystery and a missing father, and whatever had happened on this ship stayed buried beneath rust and fog. Caleb's humor, his dry, rare humor, flickered for a second like a dying match. "Of course," he muttered. "Of course, the one day I try to be normal." Eliza blinked. "What?" Caleb shook his head. "Nothing," he said, then softened his voice. "Listen to me. We take what we found. We leave quietly. Then we figure out the next step." Eliza nodded, swallowing hard. "And Ranger?" she asked. Caleb looked at the dog, at the scarless strength of him, at the way his entire being seemed tuned to a frequency Caleb could barely hear. "Ranger already figured out the next step," Caleb said quietly. "He just hasn't told me how much it's going to cost." Ranger's tail gave one controlled thump. Not comfort. Confirmation. Caleb tightened the strap of his Eberly stock pack, feeling the weight of the notebook and the tape settle against his back like a verdict. He glanced once more at the blank place on the hull where the ship's name should have been. Somebody had tried to erase this story, but a dog's nose and a man's conscience had a way of writing things back. And as they started toward the stairs, Caleb understood the cliff edge he was standing on. Intervene and risk losing Ranger, or stay silent and lose whatever part of himself still believed in doing the right thing. They left the ship the way you leave a church after a hard prayer. Quiet, careful, changed. The fog outside had thinned into strips of pale silk, and sunlight glittered on Lake Superior, like someone had scattered coins across water. Caleb Ashford paddled the kayak with measured strokes, his broad shoulders rolling beneath the olive field jacket. The Eberly stock half-track on his back felt heavier than its contents deserved. Not because of the tape or the notebook or the keys, because of what those things meant. Ranger sat in the bow, steady as a figurehead, black and tan coat catching stray flecks of sun. The German shepherd's ears stayed forward, his gaze scanning shorelines the way a seasoned guard scans doorways. He looked calm, but Caleb could read him like a pulse. Ranger was holding a readiness in reserve, the way a match holds fire. Eliza Monroe huddled in the middle of the kayak, arms wrapped around herself against a chill that wasn't from weather. Her blonde ponytail had come loose again. Her freckles stood out starkly against pale skin. 13 years old, and already carrying the expression of someone who'd learned that adults could disappear. Caleb didn't speak until they reached the far side of the inlet, where the pines thickened and the water brightened. "You said you have a place," he murmured. Eliza nodded toward the shore. "It's not a house, just a spot." A narrow path led into the trees, damp earth springing underfoot. The air smelled of pine resin and sweet grass and the cold mineral scent of the lake. Sunlight filtered through branches and broken beams, painting moving patterns on Caleb's cargo pants. Eliza's spot was a half-hidden clearing behind a fallen log, an improvised nest made from a tarp, a small cooler, and a weatherproof container tucked beneath roots. Not glamorous, but practical. A place a kid could vanish into without being seen from the water. Caleb crouched and checked the container. Batteries, granola bars, a compact tape player, scuffed, old, functional. Eliza watched him as if she expected a lecture. Caleb gave her none. He'd been young once, too, in a different kind of wilderness. "Smart," he said simply. Eliza's shoulders loosened by a fraction. Ranger circled the clearing once, nose down, then sat facing outward, posture alert. His tail barely moved. He wasn't relaxing. He was taking a post. Caleb held the cassette tape for a moment, weighing the choice. Press play, and there's no unhearing. He slid it into the tape player. The device clicked, Then words softly. Static crackled, the sound of an old recording dragged into the present. Eliza leaned in, eyes wide. Caleb kept his face neutral, but his jaw tightened. Then a man's voice emerged, tired, controlled, urgent. "My name is Elliot Monroe," the voice said, slightly distorted by age and interference. "If you're hearing this, then I didn't get to walk away clean." Eliza's breath hitched. Elliot's voice continued, steadying itself like a hand finding the rail in a storm. "I found proof that Lakeshore Salvage is removing federal equipment from the vessel in Dead Man's Reach. They're not scrapping. They're extracting data modules, components, anything with resale value." A pause, a faint sound in the background, metal clanging, distant water. And the man behind it is Victor Hale. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The name sat in the air like a nail. Elliot kept going. "Hale used to be part of the original sonar project. He believes the government abandoned him after the 1968 accident. He believes he's owed." The tape hissed. "If you're listening, do not confront them alone. They have the means. They have the will. The voice faltered for the first time. "I'm trying to get out. I'm trying to get this to someone who can—" A sharp sound like a door slam. Then the tape cut to static. Eliza stared at the player as if she could will her father back into it. Caleb felt something in his chest twist. An old, familiar knot. The moment when you realize a system won't save you in time, and you have to decide what kind of man you'll be instead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. The forest swallowed reception the same way the lake swallowed boats. Caleb exhaled through his nose. "We'll go into town," he said. Eliza looked up quickly. "To the police?" Caleb hesitated. That hesitation wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. He had a VA review coming. Any incident could become a label, and labels had consequences. Consequences could take Ranger away. Ranger's head turned slightly at the sound of his name in Caleb's mind, as if the dog could hear thoughts. "We'll start with someone who knows the lake," Caleb said instead. "Someone who understands what's real and what's rumor." Eliza blinked. "Nora?" Caleb nodded. They hiked back toward the cabin, the sunlight warm on their backs. The world looked too pretty to hold this kind of trouble. Birds sang, leaves trembled gently, even the air felt forgiving. But Caleb's mind wasn't in the trees, it was inside that tape. In the word owed. Because Caleb knew men like Victor Hale, not by face, by shape, by philosophy. Men who looked at pain and decided it was a currency. At the cabin, Caleb made a call the moment the signal returned. Sheriff Dana Klein answered on the second ring. Her voice was brisk and grounded, like boots on hardwood. Donna was in her mid-40s, the kind of woman who wore responsibility the way some people wore jewelry, daily, without fuss. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her tone always carried the implication that she didn't have time for nonsense. But she did have time for truth. "Ashford," she said. Not a greeting, a label. Caleb kept his voice even. "Dana, I need 5 minutes." Off the record, there was a pause. Just long enough for him to imagine her eyes narrowing. "Talk." Caleb didn't mention the ship in poetic terms. He didn't mention destiny or fog or how Ranger's instincts felt like an old hymn. He spoke in clean facts. A vessel in Dead Man's Reach, evidence of unauthorized salvage, a recording from a missing journalist naming Victor Hale. Silence on the other end. Then Dana said, "Victor Hale's operation is licensed." Caleb stared out the window at the tree line. Ranger lay near the door, eyes open. "Licenses don't cover federal equipment theft," Caleb replied. Donna sighed, small, controlled. The sound of a woman balancing law and politics on one palm. "Do you have proof?" she asked. Caleb's gaze flicked to the backpack on the table. "Yes." "Physical proof?" "Yes." Another pause. Then her tone sharpened. "You sure you want to step into this? You've been keeping your head down. I respect that." Caleb's mouth twitched, dry, humor thin as a razor. "Yeah, my head loves being down. It's my conscience that keeps standing up." Dana exhaled. "Bring what you have. But Caleb, no hero stuff. You understand me?" He understood. He also understood that no hero stuff was easy advice to give from behind a desk. "I'll be careful," he said. After the call, Eliza hovered near the table, hands twisting in her sleeves. "Will she help?" Eliza asked. Caleb didn't lie. "I don't know," he said. "But she'll listen if the evidence is real." Eliza nodded slowly. Ranger rose and walked to the back window. He stared toward the tree line, ears angled. Caleb watched him, then followed his gaze. A vehicle moved along the far road, a dark pickup, slow, almost casual. It passed behind the trees, visible only in fragments. The road wasn't close enough to see plates. But the timing felt wrong. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood very still, as if the air itself had thickened. Caleb's pulse picked up. Eliza whispered, "Is that?" Caleb held up a hand. "Inside," he said quietly. Eliza stepped back. Caleb watched the road through the trees. The pickup slowed, then stopped. The engine idled. A door opened, too far to hear, but close enough for Ranger to track the scent on the wind. The dog's posture changed, muscles tightening under his short coat. Caleb's mind went cold in the way it used to before missions, controlled, clinical. He didn't reach for a gun. There wasn't one. This wasn't that kind of story. But he did reach for his old habit, preparation. He slid the backpack under the table, out of sight. He turned off the kitchen light. He guided Eliza to the hallway where there were no windows. Ranger stayed at the window like a statue carved from loyalty. The pickup's engine revved softly. And then it rolled forward again, disappearing down the road as if it had never stopped. Caleb didn't move for a full minute when he finally exhaled. It came out shaky, barely, almost imperceptibly. Eliza's voice was small. "They're watching." Caleb met her eyes. He didn't soothe her with false comfort. He'd learned that lies were fragile bridges. They snapped at the worst moments. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's coincidence." Ranger turned from the window and looked at Caleb. In that gaze was something older than training. Not fear, not aggression. A quiet insistence, like a compass needle refusing to lie. Rehook, mid-chapter moment. Caleb reached down and touched Ranger's collar tag. Ranger, K9, feeling the cool metal. Ranger leaned into the touch, then placed his paw, gently but firmly, on Caleb's boot. It was a simple gesture, almost tender. Yet it carried the weight of a vow. You're not alone, and you don't get to pretend you didn't see what you saw. Caleb swallowed hard, because that paw on his boot felt like a hand on his shoulder. And he knew, in the marrow of him, that Victor Hale wasn't just stealing metal. He was stealing stories, erasing names, turning human loss into private profit. That kind of man didn't like witnesses. Caleb glanced toward the VA letter on the table, unopened. A bitter laugh tried to rise and failed. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. No hero stuff. He looked at Eliza, then at Ranger. But we're not doing nothing. Outside, the lake glittered like it didn't care. Inside, Caleb made his decision with the same quiet gravity he used to make decisions overseas. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. He would go to Sheriff Dana. He would contact someone bigger if needed. He would keep it lawful, measured, and he would do it knowing that the cost might be the one thing he feared losing most. Ranger sat at his side, steady as a promise, and somewhere out there, a man named Victor Hale had just learned he might not be alone on the lake anymore. Friday arrived the way trouble often arrived in small towns. Quietly, dressed like ordinary time, pretending it wasn't carrying teeth. All day, the sky stayed bright over North Bay. The kind of clean blue that made people mow lawns and grill burgers and believe the world was simpler than it was. But Lake Superior kept its own calendar. The waterline crept higher by inches, pulled by wind and pressure and the slow physics of a great inland sea. By late afternoon, the shallows near Dead Man's Reach looked different. Fuller, darker, restless in a way that didn't need words. Caleb Ashford checked his watch more than once, not because he loved schedules, because the lake was moving toward a deadline. He stood on his porch with Ranger at his side. The German shepherd's coat caught the slanting light, black along the back like a shadow, tan at the legs like sun-warmed earth. Ranger wore his black tactical collar and Ranger green harness, handle ready. His eyes never settled for long. He watched the tree line. He watched the road. He watched Caleb's hands. Eliza Monroe waited inside the cabin, seated at the small kitchen table like a student forced to sit still during a fire drill. Her blonde hair was tied back again, tighter now. Her freckles looked darker against skin that had gone pale with waiting. She tried to look fearless, but her foot tapped against the chair leg in a steady rhythm that betrayed her. Caleb kept his voice low. "You stay here," he told her. Eliza's chin lifted stubbornly. "I'm not a baby." "No," Caleb agreed. "You're not. That's the problem." He didn't mean it cruelly. He meant it like truth. Bravery was heavy, and she'd been carrying too much of it alone. Eliza opened her mouth to argue again, then closed it. She looked past Caleb to Ranger. Ranger stared back, calm and unreadable. Eliza exhaled, defeated but not broken. Caleb crouched and met her eyes. "If things go sideways, you call Sheriff Klein. You don't wait. You don't hesitate." Eliza nodded once. Caleb rose, adjusted the strap of his Eberly stock half-track, and stepped down from the porch. The world smelled like pine sap, warm soil, and the faint cold breath of the lake. Ranger followed him without a sound. They took the narrow trail toward the water as the sun slid lower. The light turned honey-colored through the trees, beautiful enough to feel insulting. Caleb's boots pressed into damp earth. His cargo pockets held a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and his phone, charged, signal uncertain. He wasn't armed, and he wasn't pretending he was going to outfight anyone. This wasn't a war zone. It was a crime scene that hadn't realized it was one yet. At the shoreline, Caleb pulled the kayak into the water. Ranger climbed into the bow, steady as a professional. The lake accepted them without splash, swallowing their entry like it had swallowed so many things before. As they paddled toward Dead Man's Reach, fog began to gather. Not thick at first, just a low mist that kissed the surface and rose in slow curls, as if the lake was thinking about hiding. The inlet ahead looked like a mouth. Caleb kept his strokes smooth. Ranger's ears angled forward. Halfway in, the sound reached them, a low mechanical thrum, distant and steady. A barge engine. Caleb slowed. Fog and darkness blurred the edges of the world, but the barge lights pierced through. Two bright beams sweeping across water, white and harsh, like eyes that didn't blink. The salvage crew was already there, earlier than Caleb wanted, but right on time for the lake. He guided the kayak behind a rocky outcrop, using the stone as cover. Ranger crouched low instinctively, body compact, controlled. Through the fog, Caleb saw silhouettes on the barge. Men moving with purpose, wearing reflective vests that caught the barge lights in quick flashes. A crane arm lifted and rotated slowly, cables hanging like long tendons. Caleb watched these. Ship's hull. The grounded research vessel sat at an angle, as if it were waiting to be dragged. The waterline around it was higher than before, waves licking the rock shelf where it had been trapped. Tonight, with enough pull, it might shift. Tonight, the ship might be taken. Caleb's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone and dialed Sheriff Dana Klein. The call rang once, twice. "Dana," Caleb whispered the moment she answered. "They're here. Dead man's reach. Barge, crane, crew." Dana's voice came tight with alertness. "Are you on site?" "Yes." Silence for half a beat. Then, "Caleb, do not engage. Do you hear me? Stay hidden. I'm dispatching units, but it'll take time." Caleb's gaze stayed on the barge. "They're moving equipment now." "Stay hidden," Dana repeated. "If you do something and it goes wrong," Caleb knew what she meant. "Incident, report, VA, Ranger taken." He swallowed. "I hear you," Caleb said. "But I'm not letting the evidence leave." Donna exhaled, sharp. "You're not a deputy?" Caleb's dry humor surfaced, thin and bitter. "Yeah, I've noticed." "Caleb," Dana warned. He lowered his voice. "I'll keep it clean. I'll keep it lawful. I'm just holding the line until you get here." Dana said nothing for a second. Then, 5 to 7 minutes, maybe more. Stay alive." Caleb ended the call. Ranger shifted beside him. The dog's nose lifted, nostrils flaring. Caleb smelled it a second later. Gasoline. Sharp, unmistakable, wrong in a place that should only smell like water and rust. His stomach clenched. "They're going to burn it," he whispered. Ranger's head turned toward the ship. One man on deck carried a red fuel can. Another had rags in hand. They weren't just stealing. They were erasing. Caleb's pulse slowed into something cold. He waited until the barge lights swept away, then moved. He paddled the kayak along the shadowed side of the ship, close to the hull, letting rusted steel block the beams. Ranger stayed low, perfectly silent. Caleb grabbed the lower rail and climbed. The deck was slick with moisture and flakes of rust. He moved with controlled haste, boots landing where the metal felt stable. Ranger followed, pause precise. Voices drifted through the fog, low, irritated, confident. Caleb kept to the darker side, using equipment mounts as cover. He reached the stairwell that led below deck, where he and Eliza had found the evidence before. He slipped down into the corridor, Ranger behind him. The air inside was colder. The ship felt like a lung holding bad air. Caleb's flashlight stayed off. He knew the path now by memory and touch. He reached the technical compartment and found the panel still loose. He slid it aside and reached for the hard case. His fingers wrapped around the metal edge. A sound behind him. A boot on metal. Caleb froze. Ranger's muscles tensed. A voice close and amused. "Well, look at that." Caleb turned slowly. A man stood in the corridor, broad, thick-necked, his reflective vest hanging open over a heavy jacket. He was in his early 50s, face weathered, jaw square, stubble dark against sun-browned skin. His eyes were pale and cold, the kind that measured people like inventory. He held a crowbar casually, like it was just another tool. Victor Hale. He didn't need an introduction. He carried his name the way some men carried a badge. "You're not one of my guys," Victor said, voice steady. "And you're definitely not supposed to be in my ship." "It's not your ship," Caleb replied quietly. Victor smiled without warmth. Everything's somebody's. The trick is deciding whose paperwork matters. Caleb kept his hands visible, one still on the case. Federal property, Caleb said. That paperwork matters. Victor's smile twitched. Federal property. He tasted the words like something bitter. You know what the federal government did to men like me? Promised, used, then forgot. He stepped closer. The corridor narrowed. Ranger held still at Caleb's side, eyes fixed on Victor, body poised. Victor glanced at the dog. K9, huh? Caleb didn't answer. Victor's gaze returned to Caleb. You a cop? No. A reporter? No. Victor's eyes sharpened. Then you're a hero. Caleb's mouth tightened. I'm just a man who hates thieves. Victor lifted the crowbar slightly. Funny. I'm just a man taking what I'm owed. Outside, a faint whoosh sounded. Fuel sloshing, rags being lit. The ship's belly filled with the scent of gasoline and smoke. Victor stepped forward, faster now, the crowbar rising. Ranger moved. Not with chaos, with training. In one clean motion, the German Shepherd launched and clamped onto Victor's forearm, targeting muscle, controlling leverage. Victor cursed, staggering, trying to swing the crowbar with his free hand. Caleb lunged towards Victor's wrist, using body weight and angle to drive the crowbar away. Metal clanged against the bulkhead and fell. Victor fought like a man used to winning through force. He slammed his shoulder into Ranger. He reached for a metal rod, leaning nearby, and yanked it free. Ranger held the bite, but the rod came down hard. A sharp clang. Ranger yelped, a short, pained sound, and released. Blood darkened the tan fur at his shoulder. Caleb's heart kicked. Ranger, he hissed. Ranger staggered once, then steadied, eyes still locked on Victor. The dog didn't retreat. He recentered, ready again, even wounded. Caleb's anger flared, hot, immediate, dangerous. But he forced it down. Clean, lawful, survive. Victor backed toward the corridor, breathing hard, arm bleeding where Ranger had bitten him. His eyes flicked to the case in Caleb's hand. You don't understand, Victor snarled. That data's mine. Caleb lifted the case. Not tonight. A sudden flash of light lit the corridor, fire reflecting off metal. Smoke began to creep under the doorways. The ship was starting to burn. Victor's expression twisted, rage and calculation colliding. Then, from outside, a sound cut through fog and flame. A siren. Long, demanding, real. Dana. Victor's head snapped toward the sound. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Caleb tightened his grip on the case, eyes flicking to Ranger's bleeding shoulder. Ranger stood between Caleb and Victor like a vow made flesh. The siren grew louder, closer, and in the fog, the law arrived like thunder. The sirens did not sound heroic. They sounded tired. They cut through the fog in long, unromantic waves, echoing off rock and steel and water. The flashing red and blue lights painted the mist in restless color as Sheriff Dana Klein's cruiser pulled up near the inlet road, followed by a second unit and a county fire truck. By the time law enforcement reached the ship, the small fire below deck had already begun to choke itself on its own smoke. The flames hadn't spread far. Steel did not burn easily, but the damage was enough to blacken walls and scorch insulation. Victor Hale stood on the deck with both hands visible when the deputies arrived. Not surrendering, not resisting, just calculating. Up close, under the harsh glare of cruiser lights, Victor looked older than he had in the corridor. His thick neck and broad shoulders were still powerful, but his face had the creases of a man who had clenched his jaw too many years in a row. Blood from Ranger's bite had dried in a dark patch on his sleeve. His pale eyes were sharp, but there was something beneath them now. An irritation at being interrupted by rules. Sheriff Dana climbed onto the deck herself. She moved with authority that didn't need theatrics. Her dark hair was still tied back, but strands had escaped in the wind. Her uniform was clean, pressed, practical. She had the steady posture of someone who had learned early in her career that men tested boundaries simply to see if you'd flinch. She did not flinch. "Victor Hale," she said, voice even. "Step forward." Victor's lip twitched. "Sheriff," he replied. "Didn't know this was a no-visitor zone." Donna didn't respond to the bait. "You're being detained on suspicion of theft of federal property and arson," she said calmly. Victor laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Arson? That thing's a floating corpse?" Dana's gaze hardened. "Put your hands behind your back." Two deputies stepped forward. One of them, Deputy Aaron Mills, was in his late 20s, lean and nervous under pressure, his buzz-cut hair barely grown in since academy days. He handled Victor's wrists with professional caution, eyes darting between the older man and Caleb. Caleb stood a few feet away, holding the hard case tight against his side. Ranger sat beside him, breathing heavier than usual, but upright. Blood darkened the fur along Ranger's shoulder. Dana noticed. Her eyes flicked to the dog, then to Caleb. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Caleb nodded once. "He needs a vet," he said. Dana gestured toward the fire crew. "Get EMS to check the dog." Victor turned his head, watching Ranger. "Should have kept him home," Victor muttered. Caleb didn't respond, because if he did, it wouldn't be lawful. And he had promised himself that tonight would stay lawful. Within an hour, the inlet transformed. County fire crews extinguished the remaining smoke. Deputies photographed equipment. Two men from Patsan, Victor's salvage team, were detained near the barge, their reflective vests now looking less professional and more incriminating. Then, headlights appeared at the far end of the access road. A black SUV with federal plates. Out stepped Special Agent Thomas Riley. He was in his early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy hair combed back too neatly for a midnight scene. His jaw was clean-shaven, his suit understated but expensive. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, observant, not easily impressed. He carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, like a man accustomed to paperwork deciding fates. Riley surveyed the scene without visible emotion. "You're Sheriff Klein?" he asked. Dana nodded. "And you're late?" Riley's mouth twitched faintly. "Traffic." Dana didn't smile. Caleb stepped forward, holding out the hard case. "This was being removed," he said. Riley accepted it carefully. When he opened it and examined the serial numbers, his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "This module was never decommissioned," Riley murmured. "It's still listed as restricted." Victor, cuffed nearby, scoffed. "Restricted," he said. "That's a convenient word for forgotten." Riley looked at him. "No," the agent replied. "Forgotten would mean no one cared. We care." Victor's laugh was softer this time. Rehook moment, mid-chapter. As deputies led Victor toward a cruiser, Ranger, still seated, suddenly rose and limped forward, ignoring Caleb's quiet command to stay. The German shepherd stopped directly in front of Victor and lifted his head, staring into the man's eyes without growling, without aggression. For 3 seconds, the world narrowed. Victor tried to hold the dog's gaze. He failed. His eyes flickered away first. Ranger let out a low breath, not a threat, but a verdict, and turned back to Caleb on his own. It was a small thing, but everyone on that deck felt it. Some truths did not need words. EMS technicians wrapped Ranger's shoulder in clean gauze. The wound was deep, but not catastrophic. A blunt force injury and laceration, painful, but survivable. Caleb knelt beside him, fingers resting lightly against Ranger's neck. "You're stubborn," Caleb murmured. Ranger blinked once, slow, not stubborn, committed. As Victor was loaded into a cruiser, Dana approached Caleb again. "We found something," she said quietly. "Where?" Caleb asked. "Warehouse off County Road 8. We executed a quick warrant after your call." Caleb's pulse shifted. "And?" Dana's expression softened just enough to change the air. "There was someone there." The warehouse sat low and square near the lakeshore, its metal siding weathered and its loading doors scarred by years of machinery. Inside, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed without mercy, deputies found a man tied to a chair in an office partitioned off by plywood walls. Elliot Monroe. He was thinner than the photograph Eliza had shown Caleb. Mid-40s, dark hair streaked prematurely with gray, beard grown uneven in captivity. His glasses were cracked at one lens, but his eyes, behind the fracture, were alert, stubborn, alive. When they cut his restraints, he swayed, but did not fall. "What day is it?" he asked first. "Friday," Deputy Mills answered. Elliot nodded once, absorbing that. "Good," he said quietly. "That means they didn't move it yet." They didn't tell him right away. They didn't need to. By dawn, the story had begun to travel. June Holloway arrived at the station just as the sky paled from charcoal to silver. June was 62, tall and angular, her silver hair cut into a practical bob that framed a face sharpened by decades of asking uncomfortable questions. She wore a long, neutral trench coat despite the warming air, and carried a leather satchel filled with notebooks and a recorder older than most interns she'd ever trained. Her eyes were steady, curious without cruelty. When she listened, she didn't interrupt. Caleb met her briefly in the hallway outside Dana's office. "You're the one who called this in," she said. Not accusatory, just factual. "I passed information along," Caleb replied. June nodded. "Good," she said. "Information survives longer than silence." By midday, her article was already in draft form. Illegal salvage of restricted federal equipment, warehouse detention of a journalist, coordinated response by local and federal authorities. Victor Hale's name was no longer whispered. It was printed. And that mattered. The inlet at Dead Man's Reach was sealed off by federal tape within hours. A temporary perimeter went up. Survey crews prepared to assess the ship properly, to catalog what had been stripped and what remained. The vessel no longer looked abandoned. It looked protected. Late afternoon found Caleb seated on a bench in the small veterinary clinic downtown. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and warm fur. Posters of smiling Labradors and dental hygiene charts lined the walls. The place felt almost offensively ordinary after the night. Dr. Melissa Grant entered the exam room with a calm efficiency born of years treating farm dogs and hunting companions. She was in her late 30s, with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun and freckles across her nose. Her voice carried the steady warmth of someone who had learned that animals deserve dignity, not pity. "Good news," she said. "No bone damage. He'll be sore. He'll try to pretend he's not." Caleb allowed a small breath to leave him. Ranger lay on the exam table, bandaged but alert. His eyes followed Caleb's every movement as if injury had not altered his job description. Caleb rested a hand against Ranger's chest. "You did good," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the padded table. Not for praise, for partnership. As the clinic quieted and evening approached again, Caleb's phone vibrated. "Unknown number," he answered. "Mr. Ashford?" The voice was measured, bureaucratic. "This is Officer Karen Lowell from the VA Review Board. We've been notified of last night's incident." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "Of course you have," he said. "We'll need a formal statement, Lowell continued. There are questions regarding your involvement. Caleb looked at Ranger, at the bandage, at the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. I'll answer, he said. There was a pause on the line. We're also reviewing commendations received from Sheriff Klein and Special Agent Riley, Lowell added. Caleb blinked. Commendations? We'll be in touch, she finished, and the call ended. Caleb sat very still. The fight wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. Ranger shifted slightly, wincing but determined. Caleb leaned closer, voice low. Looks like we're not done being evaluated, huh? Ranger's eyes met his. No fear, no doubt. Just that same steady presence. Outside, North Bay returned to its quiet rhythm. But now, the quiet carried a name. And names, once spoken aloud, were hard to bury again. Autumn arrived quietly in North Bay. Not with ceremony, not with applause. The pines held their color, but the air sharpened. The mornings came wrapped in pale frost that melted slowly under thin sunlight. Lake Superior turned a deeper blue, like it had decided to become more serious. Caleb Ashford stood on his cabin porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The olive field jacket rested comfortably on his shoulders, familiar as memory. His boots were planted on old wood boards that creaked in the cold. His hair, still cut short and practical, had grown slightly at the temples, silver catching more light these days. His jaw carried its usual rough stubble, but his eyes, blue-gray and watchful, looked different. Not softer, clearer. Behind him, Ranger stepped out slowly. The bandage was gone now. A faint scar traced the tan fur along his shoulder, a pale mark that only showed when the light struck it right. His gait had regained its steady rhythm, though Caleb noticed he favored that side when the weather dipped colder. Ranger stretched, front paws long and deliberate, then shook once, fur catching morning sun like sparks. For the first time in weeks, his posture wasn't scanning for threat. It was simply present. The VA meeting had taken place 3 days earlier. Caleb had driven into Duluth before dawn, Ranger seated in the passenger side of the old pickup. The city felt louder than he remembered. Traffic lights blinking, store windows bright, people moving with schedules. The VA building was beige and forgettable. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to human history. Officer Karen Lowell sat at one end of a narrow conference table. She was in her early 40s, posture upright, auburn hair pulled into a precise bun. Her glasses framed eyes that were sharp but not unkind. She wore professionalism like armor, measured, controlled, never sloppy. Years of reviewing files had given her a certain caution. She had seen too many stories end badly. Beside her sat Dr. Marcus Vale. He gave Caleb a small nod of reassurance. The meeting did not feel like a trial. It felt like a scale. Officer Lowell folded her hands. Mr. Ashford, she began, your involvement in the recent incident at Dead Man's Reach has been thoroughly reviewed. Caleb sat straight, hands resting on his thighs, Ranger lying quietly at his feet in full composure. Lowell continued. Sheriff Klein and Special Agent Riley both submitted statements. They confirmed that you notified law enforcement before engaging, avoided escalation, and secured evidence without unlawful force. Caleb didn't respond. He waited. Lowell adjusted her glasses slightly. There are also multiple references to your restraint. Restraint. The word felt heavier than any commendation. Dr. Vale cleared his throat gently. Caleb has demonstrated consistent stability over the past year, he said. His bond with Ranger has been a significant protective factor. Lowell glanced down at the file, then back up. Based on all documentation, she said, voice steady, the board has determined that your condition remains well managed. Ranger will remain in your custody." For a moment, the room went very quiet. Caleb did not exhale immediately. He simply lowered his hand and rested it on Ranger's neck. Ranger looked up, eyes calm, unaware of bureaucratic language, but fully aware of the shift in Caleb's breathing. That was enough. Dead Man's Reach was no longer open water. Federal markers bobbed near the inlet now. Survey vessels moved slowly around the grounded research ship, cataloging, documenting. The hull had been stabilized. No further damage allowed. It wasn't declared a monument. Not yet. But it was protected, which, for now, was enough. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, Nora Pike stood near the water's edge. Nora was 58, her face lined by wind and patience. Her brown hair, streaked heavily with gray, was pulled into a low ponytail beneath a ranger cap. She wore a forest green jacket and sturdy boots caked lightly with shoreline mud. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of white wildflowers. She walked to a rocky outcrop overlooking the inlet and knelt. "My husband liked this view," she murmured softly. She placed the flowers carefully between stones. "For the men who never got a name," she added. She did not cry, but she stayed there a long time. Caleb watched from a respectful distance, Ranger seated beside him. The lake was quiet, wind barely moving its surface. Eliza Monroe returned to school the following week. Her father, Elliot Monroe, now thinner but unbroken, stood outside the brick building with her that first morning. He had shaved his uneven beard and repaired his glasses. His posture had regained its quiet strength, the kind of strength built from surviving something humiliating and deciding not to let it define you. Elliot placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. "You sure?" he asked gently. Eliza nodded. Her blonde hair was brushed neatly now. The freckles remained, the stubbornness intact. But there was something steadier in her eyes. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said. Elliot smiled faintly. "That's my girl." They walked inside together. A beginning, not dramatic, but real. Back at the cabin, Caleb retrieved something he had not touched since the night of the ship. From a small wooden box near his bed, he took out the whistle. It was worn metal, scratched by time, its surface dulled but intact. The edges carried the memory of hands that had once held it with purpose. Caleb turned it over slowly in his palm. He stepped outside onto the porch. The lake stretched beyond the trees, vast and patient. He found a nail near the porch beam and hammered it in with 3 careful strikes. Then he hung the whistle there. It swayed slightly in the breeze, catching light. Ranger stepped closer. The German shepherd lifted his head, nostrils flaring gently. He did not whine this time. He did not pace. He simply stood. He looked at the whistle for a long moment, long enough that the air felt charged. Caleb watched him carefully. "Go on," Caleb murmured softly. "You can rest." Ranger exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of fatigue. It was something deeper. The kind of breath you release when you realize a door has finally closed. He turned away from the porch beam and walked to his usual spot near Caleb's chair. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ranger lay down. Not in a half-alert crouch, not with ears pricked. He stretched fully onto his side, his breathing evened, his eyes closed. No twitch, no sudden jerk, no waking startle. Caleb sat down beside him. He didn't touch him at first. He just watched. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, blue and endless. For years, Caleb had sat on this porch facing away from the water, facing the trees, facing safety. Now he let his body turn. He faced the lake, same lake that had held secrets, the same lake that had tried to swallow a story. He didn't feel anger toward it. He felt something closer to acceptance. "Guess we don't run from it anymore," he said quietly. The whistle tapped gently against wood in the breeze. A soft, metallic note. Not a command. Just a reminder. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He looked at Ranger, sleeping deeply, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For the first time since he had come north, Caleb understood something simple and profound. Destiny does not arrive with sirens. It does not shout. It does not force itself into your hands. It waits. It waits in rusted steel, in a child's courage, in a scar on a dog's shoulder. It waits in the quiet loyalty of an animal who remembers what humans try to forget. Caleb rested his hand gently against Ranger's side. "You kept the promise," he murmured. Ranger did not stir. He didn't need to. The promise had already been kept. And as the sun dipped lower over Lake Superior, painting the water in gold and blue, Caleb Ashford, former Navy SEAL, reluctant witness, stubborn believer in doing the right thing, sat facing the horizon without flinching. The lake was no longer something to turn his back on. It was something to look at, something to live beside. The whistle swayed once more, and the watchdog slept. Sometimes miracles do not look like burning bushes or parted seas. Sometimes they look like a dog who refuses to forget. They look like a man who almost walked away, but didn't. They look like courage rising quietly in a 13-year-old girl who chose truth over fear. We often pray for God to move mountains in our lives, but more often, He moves hearts. He places conviction in the chest of someone who could have stayed silent. He places loyalty in the soul of a dog who remembers what men try to bury. He places the right people in the right place at the right time, even when it feels accidental. Maybe that is how God works most of the time, not with thunder, but with nudges, not with spectacle, but with steady guidance. In your own life, there may be a moment when you are standing at the edge of something difficult. A decision, a truth, a quiet calling that won't leave you alone. Listen closely. Sometimes that gentle pull is not coincidence. Sometimes it is grace. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that courage still exists, that loyalty still matters, that doing the right thing is never wasted, I invite you to share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever felt guided towards something you couldn't explain? Have you ever seen faith show up in an unexpected way? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about honor, sacrifice, and the bond between a warrior and his dog, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you and your family. May He guard your steps, steady your heart, and send the right companions into your life, sometimes with 2 legs, sometimes with 4. And may you never ignore the quiet miracle waiting at your door.